Welcome everybody to the third Deltathink discussion webinar based on our News and Views series. We'll start off by introducing the topic and the speakers, and then I'll ask them a few questions. But our real goal is to hear your questions and hopefully to see your questions showing up in the Q&A that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. There's a little button there, and this really is about your questions. If we don't get to all of your questions today, what we will do is we'll collect them and we'll answer them in some fashion, either in an email or potentially with a post on the Deltathink blog. So let's get started. Why this topic? Well, sustainability for open access has definitely been a critical concern, and it really doesn't matter whether you're a publisher, a librarian, a researcher, or a funder. Sustaining open access is quite critical, especially given the fact that open access is definitely increasing. The amount of content that's published through an open access, CC BY license, from its inception is definitely on the rise. And interestingly, most of this open access is supported through APCs, article processing charges, and in doing so, as we've all discussed in many different forums, it really puts a lot of the burden for sustainability onto the individual researcher, their institution, or potentially their funder, whoever is paying for their APC. So what we're going to talk about today are collective models. And what is interesting about a collective model is it seeks to say, at least in the ways that some of them have been applied to date, how do we support a common good? How do we do so in a way that, and I'll do the air quotes, we avoid free riders or minimize them? And what that really means when you think about subscriptions is how could we possibly leverage a subscription in this environment in a way that pulls in people that benefit from content on the reading or consuming side rather than solely folks that are on the consumption side. And so today we're going to have Raym, as you can see, Raym Crow, managing partner at Bridge Group and a senior consultant with SPARC, and Sara Rouhi from PLOS, the director of strategic partnerships, talk a little bit about their experience with collective models and some of the derivations. So I'll jump right in. And we're going to start, I will address questions to each of you, but I totally expect that you will chime in whether or not your name has been attached to the question. So Raym, if I had a journal or a book portfolio that I wanted to make open and I was considering some type of collective model, what types of questions would you ask me to determine if a collective model was suitable for my portfolio? What kind of levers or components of these models do you call upon when you're architecting, a particular offering?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think first we look at the resource. So is it closed or is it open to start with? For example, if it's an existing service, so something that's already closed, like most subscription journals and other kinds of resources, monographs. Then provides leverage in terms of crafting a model that you can then open. If it's kind of a born open resource like PLOS, then it's more challenging because you don't have that kind of lever. With new services, even if you want it to be open, you can use some of the advantages of having that leverage by making the openness conditional. Another characteristic is whether it's a one-time funding effort or it's an ongoing resource. So if sometimes if you're trying to develop or fund the development of a resource, an infrastructure project, for example, that's constructed a particular way that's got certain characteristics. Where if you need to sustain a journal, for example, or any kind of resource on an ongoing basis, you need to maintain stability over time, and that obviously affects the way you construct the offer. Whether the amount of the resource is variable or fixed. Usually with PLOS's case, for example, I mean the amount of number of articles being published in any given year is fixed for the journal. It's not variable depending on the amount of resources that are collected. For other kinds of projects, Open Library of the Humanities, I think, works this way. If they get more resources, they expand the amount of content provided because they're going out aggregating multiple publishers. So that's another dimension to this. Identifying the audience. I mean, and that's got a variety of angles to it. Sometimes you can specifically, with an existing service, you can identify who the audience, at least the current audience is. Well, the subscription-based obviously is the most obvious example. Other times you can't, and it's like any other new product in that sense. But it still requires, it needs to be dealt with in order to set the participation terms and the participation fees. And that also gets the very critical issue, which is the size and composition of the audience that you're trying to reach, the target group. If you're a collective action of 4 or 5 institutions that come together, for example, to fund open source infrastructure projects. You see that all the time, where large research institutions will do that because it's in their best interest to do so. They're going to get enough local benefit to justify the investment, and they don't really care if some of the social benefit of the project leaks out to other institutions. And there may even actually be network effects where they want that to happen. But for their part, they want to control where it's going, and it's critical for them, and so they're willing to act on their own. With larger but still relatively small groups of a couple hundred or fewer institutions, those can sometimes be more culturally coherent, and they communicate more. They have more in common. They have social incentives to work with those kind of smaller groups, and so you can construct an offer differently if you're going after, say, 75 or 100 institutions in a particular area. More often, though, you have large and diverse target groups where you're going out and where it's difficult to define who's in and who's out, where you don't have the benefits of social incentives, where the communication between the group is very attenuated because they're just spread out. And in those cases, you can't really use pro-group collective behavior to motivate participation. You can do that with smaller groups. It's not perfect, but it can work. The larger the group, the greater the resources available. So the more the merrier type approach to funding things, but the more difficult it is to coordinate them. So one way around that is to use consortia especially focusing on pro-open consortia to basically break that large group into smaller groups. But that also that leads to the whole issue of what if you're on a continuum where at one end you have altruism, at the other end you have very compelling private benefits. That's what happens when the larger the group, the more important the private benefits are. That is private benefits exclusive to institutions that contribute to a resource. So often you'll see with collective models, they'll have a membership model where membership is, the main benefit of participating, and that's typically a fairly soft benefit. It depends on the resource, and at the other end, you can have very high value private benefits. The issue with those is they tend to be expensive to provide, and so that complicates the construction. So you take all those features of the resource, and then you look at what the mission and financial objectives are of the entity doing the offering, and that really goes into how you design an offer.
That's really helpful. So I think most of the ones that we've seen to date that have been announced, models like this, and I understand that there are probably some nits to pick in the specific definitions, but overall, they've seemed to be around flipping an existing resource. and from a closed resource per se, a subscription resource, a pay for access resource, to an open resource. So Sara, PLOS is a little different because everything is open, has been open, will always be open. There's no incentive to say, well, we're going to close this if this doesn't work. So tell us a little bit about what you've designed for PLOS and how it's working, and maybe even some of the challenges from approaching this from without an existing subscriber base.
Yeah, it was a different question we were really trying to answer. So in the case of the model that we've sort of soft launched with libraries and are going to more formally launch to authors and the broader community in a month or so, really the problem we were trying to solve was a switch in sort of internal models for PLOS. So our two highly selective journals, PLOS Medicine and PLOS Biology, very low acceptance rates, very sort of high touch bespoke services for authors who publish in those journals. Those have historically been cross-subsidized in terms of their APC cost. And we've always done that because we haven't wanted to expose our authors to the APCs that actually cover the cost for publishing in journals with that level of selectivity. So rather than charge, $5,000, $6,000 in APC, we've always wanted to do a cross subsidy to keep that fee reasonable, which at this point is $3,000 for each of those articles. And so given the challenges around making highly selective content openly available via APCs, and the need for experimentation right now to look at other models. I mean, it's always kind of been a PLOS imperative to say, what can we do besides APCs because of the exclusionary aspect of APCs? We thought, might this be a time to pilot something for these two journals that allows them to cover cost, but at the same time proves to the broader community that you can make this content open without charging really high APC? So the question was, can we find a new way to cover cost? Who would be the right pool of institutions or partners to do that with? And then how do we construct a model that equitably distributes cost amongst the institutions that would see the highest private benefit for participating, such that we can achieve a stated revenue target with a capped margin, with the intention of then taking any revenue that goes above that margin and redistributing it to the members of the collective or the community once that revenue target is hit. So the goal here is really, how do we demonstrate financial sustainability for highly selective publishing? It's not revenue maximization. And so built into the model, built into the public website, built into the contract, we commit to redistributing overages beyond what we need to the members of the of either collective for PLOS Biology or PLOS Medicine, should that target be reached. And so it's a different proposition for the institutions that have expressed interest in participating.
So now, just historically, from a logistics perspective, PLOS has always dealt with individual payments from, for APC. Yeah. And I mean, and I'm sure that's just one thing. What were some of the differences in moving from a model where you focused predominantly on an individual to one with institutions?
Well, just on the internal side, shifting PLOS's internal systems from sort of retail to wholesale, for lack of a better way of putting it, has been a big shift internally in terms of making sure that PLOS has the, all of the internal capabilities to handle customer support, billing, all of that stuff for institutions. But then really to be able to execute on this, and Raym suffered with us through this, you really need good data. And one of the innovations of this model, and Raym gets full credit for this is the first model out there that I'm aware of that takes into account and attributes value to the benefit that contributing authors receive when they publish, and the cost of publishing represented within a contributing author group, not just corresponding authors. And so once you expand the pool, not just how do we figure out affiliations and funding sources for corresponding authors, but then how do we do that for all their contributors, that just leads to a data lift that is very, very high. And thankfully, that's actually pushed PLOS to engage, as you well know, Anne, in a very robust data ecosystem project to get all of our ducks in a row with respect to data. But this effort really showed us that to do anything like this well, you have to have really, really, cleaned, curated data. You need to have good analysts who know how to interpret it. And then you need to be willing to share it with the library partners that want to participate, and be transparent about, this is how we got the data, this is what we said, this is where the inconsistencies are, and this is how we're using it to then build the model that we want you to participate in.
So I'm going to ask the same question in a second, Raym, to you on another example. But Sara, for the example of PLOS, could you be a little bit more specific of the nuts and bolts components? You're coming to me to say, to present this as an option for me to support your journal. I'm a librarian at Consortia.
Yeah.
What are you saying? What's in it for me?
So we basically, the first thing we do when speaking to libraries about this is we just explain the situation with cross subsidies with these two journals and how we want to cover cost. We then share the cost and the target we're going to cover. And if people want to know that, I can drop that in the chat right now. That's going to be on the website when it's public. We explain how, what that cost covers. We explain the capped margin. We're only trying to get 10% of a margin on top of the actual direct and indirect costs together. And then once the collective as a group hits that revenue target, any further revenue will be redistributed amongst the members annually. And for institutions that choose not to participate in the, we're calling it PLOS Community Action Publishing. So if they choose not to participate in the medicine community or the bio community, then the consequence of that is their authors, when they go to submit in one of those journals, will be subject to non-member fees. So starting January 1st, there will no longer be APCs for those two journals. The collective will be in effect. Institutions, as they join, will kind of accrue that benefit. And then if your authors submit and they are not, they don't belong to an institution that's a member of the collective, they will basically have the duration of the peer review process to join. We'll actively reach out to institutions and say, your author is submitted as a lead author. They don't have a membership. Do you want to join? And in many cases, the cost of the institution joining will be less than if the individual author pays a member fee. Not in all cases, but in some. And so as long as the institution has joined the collective before the article is accepted, we will allow that article to go through with no fee. It's worth mentioning all Research for Life countries are automatically members in this model. And then the actual pool of institutions, the way we identified who would be the folks who would benefit the most from participating, those are institutions that have a corresponding or contributing author publishing in either journal in the last 6 years. So we had to do a pretty deep, extensive deep dive back. And we wanted it to be a number of years so that we could kind of level out any spikes institutions see in participation.
So Raym, if you were thinking about one of the folks that have a model like this that you're allowed to speak about, could you describe how the model works and just, as I said, the nuts and bolts again for potentially maybe an organization that's flipping a resource?
Sure. I think well, there are a couple of examples. I mean, Subscribe to Open is getting, some visibility these days. I mean, it's constructed with those kind of issues that I outlined at the beginning in mind. I mean, it's and it's informed by collective action issues, the collective action problem. It's designed to not require pro-group, pro-collective behavior, though. Annual reviews where we developed it, they've had 1,300 subscribers to some of the journals spread all over the world. You can't organize that large of and diverse of a group cost effectively. So the trick there was to set up the model so it was an individual institution was making a decision and it was in their best interest, that was in their best interest to make. This relies, in practical terms, it relies on the way the procurement system works. It goes through the standard procurement system so that you're not trying to get people together and have a collective decision on whether to do something. You're basically saying, do you want to, and it's the way the trigger, the inducement to participate in at least an annual reviews case currently, and it doesn't have to work this way, is to offer a 5% discount to institutions for participating and make it an opt-out kind of offer. So saying, assume you want to get a 5% discount. If you commit, we'll give you a 5% discount, whether or not the offer were to succeed. And if you don't, you forego it. So if you want that, the journal, presumably, you're subscribing to it, so presumably you do. If you want to insure it, then you need to commit. And it's, you know, the idea is to be painless and it recurs every year to provide the long ongoing stability I mentioned before.
Can I just flag something there about that?
Sure.
So I think the interesting distinction to make, because of like you said, the difference between, you know, flipping something that's closed versus having content that's open, right? In the case of subscribe to open, correct me if I'm wrong, what folks are committing to and getting the discount for is making this content open for the duration of that term, right? But in the case of PLOS, what folks are committing to is basically securing the benefit of freeing their authors from non-member charges. So it's supporting their authors' publishing behavior as opposed to opening something that's already closed. Do you agree with that?
Right.
Characterization, is that right?
Right. No, I mean, this isn't limited to open resources and collective action. I mean, even, you know, with market kinds of resources, you need to have some kind of, you have to have a value proposition that somebody's willing to pay for. And, you know, so in collective terms, I tend to think of it as inducements to participate, but it's still basically the same thing. So, you know, the way PLOS is constructing it, there's a particular kind of inducement, and the private benefit is the ability to publish, as opposed to, you know, access to the journal. And, you know, so with subscribe to open, there's also other kinds of added benefits depending on the publisher, access to, you know, back files and the like. Working with MIT Press currently and that's a, you know, a closed resource. I mean, they're not born open monographs, wanting to make the monographs open, and that's a matter of constructing an offer that uses, you know, these kinds of you know, private benefits to make it attractive to get enough institutions to participate to, you know, cover the cost of providing the monographs. And so that'll be, you know, be shared, you know, reasonably soon.
Raym, one quick question, and then we will go to an audience question. So it sounds to me like, from a sustainability perspective, it is really critical over the long term that there is some kind of a private benefit. And that counteracts the notion that this is an altruistic appeal, as opposed to, you know, I'm actually acting in my own self-interest in order, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but honestly, you know, budgets get tight. There has to be a reason why this is compelling for me to fund or to request funding for. So is it fair to say that in this environment that a private benefit is a critical factor?
Yes, in most cases. I mean, it's because the situation, I mean, again, unless you get into a situation where it also depends on how you define private benefit, because you could say, you know, I talked about those small groups of institutions earlier, you know, that funded infrastructure. Well, you know, the fact that they have control is a form of private benefit. You know, membership, well, it's fairly soft, is a form of, you know, private benefit. So, you know, unless you've got a group, and this isn't just in our world. This is, you know, all collective action in all realms of activity. It's you know, social and political as well as, you know, economic. You know, it's, you know, it's axiomatic. I mean that you know, if you have a small group, you can that is a very closely knit, communicates a lot, you know, shares things. Their feedback mechanisms. They can you know, they like social incentives, both positive and negative. Then you might be able to rely on, you know, we're going to do this because we all want it, and it's a shared resource. But if you start talking about a large amount of money and a large number of institutions or actors that need to participate in it over time, then you know, the need to come up with these kind of benefits. And they don't have to just be market benefits. They can, but they have to be something that someone finds worth, you know, paying for.
Okay, I'm actually going to go to the second question we got first, and then I'll go back. In these models, is there theory? Does the benefits have to grow over time to sustain commitment?
No, it has to. remain adequate. I mean, just in this way, it's analogous to a price and value of a commercial service. So, you can't keep. I guess it's, you presumably can't keep raising prices without changing without the value increasing. All things being equal in terms of inflation and the like. So, and it's the same thing here. There's an added risk with an open resource is, it's not, again, the same we talked about before. It's not, if it's a public good, if it's open access, it's not excludable once you've decided to make it excludable. Now, it may be excludable initially before when it's gated, but once it's open, it's open. And so there are a couple dynamics that come into play. One is with recurring offers like subscribe to open and others like this, there may be the perception that comes in that, okay, it's been successful for the last 3 or 4 years, it will continue to be successful. So you have to have, it has to be designed in such a way that you can regain people's attention and let them know that, no, this isn't inevitable. It can go back to gated. It's recurring. Last year's open will remain open, but this year depends on your action this year. So it has to, those things have to be designed, into it, and you have to also look for new ways to, get institutions to participate. And there are ways to do that within subscribe to open but it's got to be designed in.
So we had a question. The first question we had. Do you feel, or what kind of effect do you feel the pandemic might have on collective action initiatives, specifically related to an institution's willingness or ability to pay, budget constraints and such? And I'm curious, Sara, if we might even start with you, because you're out there building this program right now, and you started post-pandemic, really. You didn't start,
Well, no, actually. So I started talking to, yes and no. I started, talking sort of at a very high level with institutions in like November, December, right? That's when we first started talking. And then as we got into January and February and started really getting some meat on the bones, we found ourselves, Raym and I were like, the world is changing even from November, and how is this going to impact how institutions are engaging with us? And the really interesting thing that I probably should have anticipated but hadn't was for institutions that were, because we're not just launching collective action, we have a number of other models that we're looking at for institutions. And so institutions who perhaps were interested in models for the other 5 journals and then collective action for the 2, as COVID started to kick in and libraries started to anticipate, major additional cuts as a function of the impact on higher ed, they came back saying, okay, we probably can't pursue a deal for the other 5, but we really actually want to make the collective action one a priority because A, the journals, biomedical being what it is, it just seems like this is the time to support a model like this. And B, there's a number of sort of activist libraries, particularly in the US, that are just making a point of being at the leading edge of supporting new business models, particularly supporting nonprofits that are working in this space. And so those libraries, had said, pretty much count us in, we're gonna find a way to find the money for this. And if it's not this year, it's going to be next year. So it was really heartening to see how many institutions, didn't mince words about the budget challenge, but have chosen as a sort of to make it a priority to find a way to support the model, if not this year, then diving in the next year. So we might actually see that the model, we've made, Raym and I made very conservative participation assumptions, just given the current climate with the collective action model. But we might actually see that actually the impact might be on other kinds of agreements we're trying to negotiate, and not this model so much particularly.
Yeah, you have to have benefits sufficient again to compel people to participate. And this is a bad time to launch anything. A traditional gated service. So there's and nobody knows the way that these things are going to play out. So it has to you want to construct it in such a way that it's not there's a single point of failure where that's budget sensitive. There's got to be an escape route.
So Raym, this question I think is mostly directed towards you, but Sara, feel free to jump in. So with someone that says they've been following and trying to promote the model of Scope 3, and your models seem to be a further developed version of it, I'm sorry. I was wondering if Scope 3 had any role in inspiring what you're working on with your clients, and would you compare your model with Scope 3?
Well, Scope, I think, they're both, all these models we're talking about are collective models, right? Now, Scope 3 took a particular approach that was, ambitious in terms of what they were trying to do in terms of how they converted the relationship with the publishers and the like. And it illustrated some of the challenges of doing these kind of collective, that was one where it was still a large group of institutions, but it was still focused on a high energy physics, community. So it was, narrower in that respect. But it also took a long time to do, and a lot of effort on the part of Salvatore Mele and other people to, make that thing work and explain it to people, and that's great. And it's I don't want to say it's a cautionary tale, but it illustrates one of the issues of collective models is you have to be able to do it in a way that the coordination costs don't overwhelm the sort of. So again, coordination costs are universal to collective action issues in any domain. So but it's the larger the action, the greater the cost. And so what we need to do is on individual projects keep those costs as low as possible by the way the model is constructed, and in a larger perspective, and this is an area where SPARC is working, is how can we set up a framework, collective framework, where multiple collective offers can come in and be coordinated more cost effectively and efficiently by working with pro-open consortia, for example.
So related to that, another question is, do you think the Scope 3 model is scalable?
I don't want to say it's not. I would say it's going to be scalable cost effectively. And again, I can't remember the name of it. Søren can speak to this better than I can now, because it would, to be scalable, you'd probably want to, streamline it or set up structures that make it scalable. I'm not entirely sure, and this is not because it's not this way. I just don't know whether it's actually scalable at this point.
Okay. Sarah, someone was wondering if there's any information on the web about the PLOS community collective action. So I'm sure we can provide that.
Yeah, I'm trying. The website isn't up yet. You will be the first to know, Richard, when the website is. So I will make sure everybody is aware of that. We're still working on that.
Okay. And then I'm going to go back a bit to a question we had a little earlier, which I like its phrasing. It says, what do you think of, quote, shaming strategies, i.e., here are institutions that read and should fund, etc., whether it be archive or whatnot. And I just want to add to that, Sarah, I'm curious, because not that in any way, shape, or form you or PLOS are shaming folks, but you mentioned pulling in contributing authors as opposed to, so I'm curious if that is not so much shaming, but if that's even a method of trying to get to that long tail of folks that participate in a journal. So, but Raym, you can warm yourself up for the shaming question, and we'll let Sarah go first on contributing author.
Yeah, I want to spend a little time on the contributing author piece, because Raym won't toot his own horn about this, so I'll toot it for him. The challenge of what to do with so-called read institutions, and it's important to remember with our model, all we mean by read institutions is an institution that has not had any historic publishing in either journal in the last 6 years. So that could be a Howard Hughes Medical Institute, that could be, Appalachia State. It's not a function of how big your institution is or what kind of research you do. The reason we had to look at contributing authors, right, is if we focus on just the affiliations of corresponding authors, because they're highly selective journals, it would have led to a very small pool of institutions that would have had to carry a lot of cost weight, which just wasn't going to be sustainable. No one was going to participate at those fee points. So by looking at the affiliation of the contributing authors, what became clear was there is a whole universe of so-called read institutions that only ever publish as contributing authors, but never as corresponding authors, that if you only focus on corresponding authors, you lose all those institutions. So by pulling them all in and looking at the contributing author affiliation, you effectively identify a read group that has some kind of benefit. It's not the same benefit as a corresponding author affiliated institution, but some kind of benefit in participating in this model, if only to shield their own authors from non-member fees if and when they should decide to publish in these journals. So you might have a couple of institutions in the last couple of years. Yeah, MIT is a good example in PLOS medicine. They don't publish that much in PLOS medicine. So they might have 1 or 2 papers where they are a lead author. But other institutions, University of Nebraska, for example, may have 10, 11, 12 papers where they are contributing authors, but they're never lead authors. There's value to them as well. And so bringing those institutions in starts to chip away at the problem of how do we make read institutions see value here without having their participation be altruistic or donation-based, right? The third component, I think, to bringing in read institutions is really going to start figuring out how to meaningfully look at usage statistics, because of course, if an institution is reading our stuff a lot but never publishing, there's value there as well.
Sarah, is that more like the shaming that Lisa's talking about?
If I can go to the Oberlin group and say, of all of your members, these are the ones that read our content the most, and there's value. It's not a $10,000 a year level value. It's a smaller sum, but there's a case to be made. Those institutions, many of the read institutions that I talk to, they want to participate in some way, but it has to be grounded in something, right? It cannot be a donation. And so we're figuring out how to do that. And in all of our models, especially with the consortia that I've talked to, we have a mechanism for institutions that have never published in either of those journals to participate at the lowest tier point. So anyone can join to act basically as insurance, so that if and when they ever have an author in either the lead or co-author positions, they won't be exposed to fees. So that's the thinking there. But I'm realizing I'm drifting from the original question. Oh, the shaming. I don't want to shame anything. I want to flip that and say we want to call attention to the institutions that have chosen to participate in this. I mean, if you are on the leading edge and saying, at a time of COVID with huge budget cuts, we are still finding a way to participate in this, your name is going to be emblazoned on the website, all the partners that engage in this, the amount that they pay, the tiering, all of that's going to be public on our site. So everyone's going to know what everyone's paying. And then at the end of every year, we're going to sort of provide an annual report of this is where we are towards the goal. These are the members. These are the members who joined. These are the members who left. This is the amount that we got in non-member fees. And, if and when we hit the target and then start redistributing the overage beyond the target that we need, we will share what that overage was and how it was redistributed. So, full accountability to the community and transparency in how we're doing this, I think, is the key to making it feel meaningful for the organization.
Sarah, one quick question and then a comment, and then Raym, I haven't forgotten. I still want you to talk about other, to take Lisa's shaming question to see if there's other application in other models that you've been working with. But Sarah, so you talk about this non-member fee, and I don't know how much of this you're making public yet or not, but how does that compare, for example, to an APC of today? So I know it's not an APC. I totally get that, but I'm trying to understand what the potential cost burden would be to a contributing author. And, in some of these articles, I've seen articles in my time that have had like 200 contributing authors. Does it apply to every single one of them?
Right. That's a great question. And that's an important nuance. For the pilot period, which is 2021 through 2023 calendar years, we are not going to be charging contributing authors fees. There's a number of reasons for that, but which I can sort of get into offline. But the focus is going to be if we can get the corresponding authors, for the most part, who are publishing the most to be members, we will not penalize them if their contributing authors are not members. We'll actually use the submission as an opportunity to reach out to the contributing author institutions to say, hey, you've got this 3-year window where your authors aren't going to be subjected to these fees, but you are publishing with us. So consider joining rather than exposing them to that in future. The non-member fees will aggressively go up. So, and we'll share, I think, at least a 3-year, if not 5-year timeline of what those fees will be on our site. But this year, so the current author charge is $3,000. Next year it'll be $4,000, the non-member fee. The following year will be $5,000. And then the goal for 2023 is that the non-member fee of 2023 reflects the actual cost it takes to publish one article in each.
Okay, so I'm actually slightly confused now, so help me with this. So you have a situation where the corresponding author is in a member institution,
yep,
but 4 contributing authors are not. So are you saying that for that article, each of those 4 contributing authors are asked for $3,000?
No. For the Raym's like heads. My head's explained. For the and this is where the FAQ is going to be critical, because this is where the rubber hits the road, and like this is the first question my library partners are all asking, which is exactly right. If a contributing author comes through and is from a member institution, it doesn't matter what's happening. Sorry, I hate contributing and corresponding because there's such long words to say that you realize too late that you've said the wrong one. If the let's go lead and co-author. That's shorter. If the lead author is a member, it doesn't matter what the status of the co-author.
Oh, okay.
We will kind of basically use that as a lead generation mechanism. We'll reach out to the libraries associated with the co-authors and say, hey, just a heads up, your authors are engaging. You should consider joining the program. If you want to go through all the iterations, if the lead author is not a member, but her co-authors, one of them is, the lead author will get a discount on the non-member fee to reflect the participation of a co-author in the collective. And if neither lead nor co-authors have any affiliation with a member institution, then the lead author will be subjected to a non-member fee.
Okay, so what you're saying is that if someone's a member, you're golden. If the leader, if someone isn't, there's only one non-member fee assessed against.
Yes, yeah, no. Each person is, yeah, no. There's just one. There's just one fee, and really the purpose of that is, and Lisa's probably chuckling to herself a little bit because we've talked about this. The purpose of that is to give libraries the flexibility to accelerate their participation in the model at their own pace, right? If there was this punitive, your authors can't publish at all if you don't participate, you're suddenly engaging in a set of disincentives that put libraries in a really hard place. Like, this is a horrible budget environment. You're forcing me to do this. So by having the non-member fee, we have a second revenue stream that's compensating for the fact that it's very natural that there's going to be a slow uptake on the community side, just given the current constraints that we're in. And so that's what we're trying to do here. But the goal is not to make a ton of money with these non-member fees. The goal is that when an institution sees the non-member fees, they go, we should just join the collective and avoid that. Raym, I don't know how much of that was wrong.
But Raym, I also want you to think about the root question we were talking about, that, quote, shaming question. But really, as I said, I'd like to reposition it as, how do you reach beyond those people that had directly contributed? Can you get to the long tail? Can you get to the people that have some benefit, but it's diminishing? So Sara has a very concrete example. I'm curious, in what she was talking about, I'm curious if there are any of the other models you're aware of, other instances, have situations where they are attempting to kind of get that long tail involved. And do they ever make an altruistic appeal?
Well, yeah, you can make an altruistic appeal all the time. Successful one is the issue. And when you talk about sanctions and these kinds of things, it gets back to the issue I mentioned at the outset in terms of defining the target group. These kind of sanctions or shaming, if you will, only make sense if there's a definable target group. If it's everybody in the world, then it's basically, and this is frankly where the term of our free rider has meaning. It's not a pejorative term. It actually indicates, for in our context, institutions that don't contribute, even though they might otherwise be expected to because they get a benefit. You're not saying that institutions that or never use a journal, for example, and never have anything to do with it, are free riders because they don't contribute. That's because you've defined them out of the group. And you need to define the group because depending on the model you use, if it's based, you want contributions to be visible. Individual institutions, like if they know their contributions visible, it's more difficult to free ride, to just melt into the background and not participate. And so the offer needs to be constructed to make institutions' participation visible, even if you don't have a website that says, okay, pointing and laughing because somebody didn't participate, or some kind of shaming exercise like that, because librarians loathe that. And I mean, and I appreciate that as part of the ethos, but so it's just something we have to deal with in designing these things. At the same time, recognize that these behaviors are social behaviors that I'm not dictating. They're basically, so if I mean, if you have a small enough group, if you define it, whether it's a consortium that's a part of a subroutine of a larger offer or whatever, where everybody can see what other people are doing. Well, they know from not only participation in a collective offer, but participation for years in these things, who's going to how people have behaved in the past, how they're and there's these implicit trade-offs and paybacks over time, and it's human nature and social nature, and so you take that into account when you're designing it to make sure that those things aren't lost. But you're not really; those are more effective, frankly, than any policy you try to implement that penalizes somebody. That then needs in some kind of enforcement mechanism, letting the group. I don't want to say police itself, but basically, impose these social incentives is more effective.
So I'm just looking over the questions here. And also for those of you that are not looking at the chat, and I highly recommend that you do, there's some interesting conversation going on in the chat. I will highlight some of it if we have time, but moving up to the questions. One here, I thought I understood something, but now I'm confused. If you reach your target, your title flips to OA for that year, but do you still keep charging APCs or non-member fees? If so, isn't that kind of double dipping? And I just also want to say one thing real fast. I think that you might be conflating two models. So the PLOS model is one thing, and it's always open and it stays open forever, whereas some of the other models that Raym spoke about are where there is a potential that you go in for a bid for that year, you get that target met, and you flip to OA. In those models, I believe, and Raym, correct me if I'm wrong, what's happening is those who chose not to participate in the collective, if you will.
And that's subscribed open, right?
Right, yeah. Well, what they're doing is they have not gotten the 5% discount that was offered to those who did, but there are still no APCs. Is that true?
Yeah, well, APCs are typically a side issue on subscribed open. I mean, you can combine them. There are some models that do combine them. But yeah, the short answer, or shortish answer, is that with subscribed to open, it's not a public threshold. Basically, and PLOS may or may not do this to say, okay, this is what they're going to be transparent about what their target is and how they arrived at it and everything else. And you can and some collective models work on that kind of we're going to put a new roof on the church kind of thing, where you have a thermometer and where are we relative to the threshold we're trying to get to. Subscribe to open it's not a public target, because you're not trying to, don't want to signal that this is a collective action. It's not. It's basically, if you want a 5% discount and to ensure that you're going to continue getting the journal, you need to act. Because keep in mind, the way it's the only the guarantee the publisher is providing is if everybody participates, we'll open it, and they reserve the right. If one institution were to not participate, they can fail it. And there's this imperfect market information works in the publisher's benefit, not in a cynical, manipulative way, but just in a practical way.
So I think the way I would take that back to the person who asked this question is there are different elements of different models. So we're not talking about one model. We're talking about one concept that's applied to many different models. So, and those models are designed in a way that would, in PLOS's case, for example, they have non-member fees and they're always open, they're never closing. And in some of these other models, it's through the subscription mechanism that they're opening, and at that point, no one is paying for APC charges in some of the instances, but it can vary based on the model that you put together based on some of the specifics Raym spoke about at the beginning. Now, I'm sensitive to the fact that we're really coming close to the end of time here. So in 30 seconds or less each of you, we have a question. Are there any important differences or even nuances between disciplines as it relates to collective open, humanities versus social sciences versus STEM, etc.?
Yes. I'm going to go with yes.
Well, you do a little more than that, Sarah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have less experience with publishing in social sciences and humanities. I have it as a researcher, but not as working on the publishing space. Raym should speak to this more. I suspect some of these models become harder in spaces where the research object is dramatically different, the cost of the object is different, and the timeline for peer review and dissemination is different. So not super helpful, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, it really depends on the resource. I mean, MIT Press is, deals with social sciences and humanities as well as STEM monographs. And, we're not expecting, the collective motivation or impulse or collective behavior to vary between STEM resources and social science and humanities resources. It's now we could argue that libraries may be more amenable to collective models for the social sciences and humanities in the case of journals because they don't see APCs as being a viable option. But that's really kind of a extraneous. I think I don't see any difference. It's more those other characteristics I mentioned at the outset. The nature of the character, whether it's open, closed, variable, fixed, one-time, recurring, things like that, are more important than what the actual resource is.
So I think that's really interesting, and I've started to think about it this way too. Is that there's this menu of choices or conditions that you have to sort through in order to design a model, and you might call upon any of the different components or practices that you've seen, or you even create new ones, so that could be adapted to a discipline. So it's not the underlying concept that is changing by discipline, it's how you implement it. So we have one last question I really want us to get to. I'm just looking at the time here. And we'll give you a little bit more on this one, maybe a minute each. So, and I might chime in too. So Rod, I apologize for saving you to last, but your question was so wonderful as a closing question that I elected to do that. Looking at the longer term, do you think a few standard OA facilitation models will emerge that work for many publishers and many libraries or consortia, or will the landscape become even more fragmented? There's a great deal of complexity in the many emerging OA models.
Yeah, I think in a way both. But let me, I think the answer is more yes. I think there'll be, and yes, in the sense that there will be a convergence in the sense, again, if libraries are serious about wanting to do community supported infrastructure, community supported resources, collective funded models, there has to be a more efficient way of doing it. Now there may be a lot of variety because as we've talked about for the last hour, and especially the last few minutes, there's a lot of just detail depending on the resource, the discipline, everything else. All these things can vary. At the same time, they have the same kind of criteria and design issues that need to be addressed. So I think what we're working for in the immediate future, trying to put together, is again a framework that allows us to bring these various collective models to libraries and library consortia, specifically in a way that makes it more efficient to present them, where they understand, they can sort through them and act on them and understand them, and from the publisher's perspective or whoever's offering the resource perspective, it fits into a structure so that it can be not automated, but facilitate those offers.
Sarah, anything you want to say about that? Fragmented or more concentrated models?
Well, honestly, I think so much of that is going to depend on how many libraries choose to really tackle the very complicated transformative deals with the big publishers first. If they do that, there just won't be a lot of money left to do anything anyway. And then in which case, you know, no, it doesn't matter how many models are out there, libraries are going to have to make really hard decisions about which ones to support. The libraries that are engaging with the new models first, hopefully will have more choices and can engage with that when they think about transformative agreements. But yeah, I think fragmented is probably how it's going to go.
So it's interesting, my opinion on this, I was thinking about this as you both were talking, and as Raym was talking about a framework, is that at the end of the day, there's only so many things to sell, right? So, you know, we're obviously access is off the table, we're not selling that. So, you know, so again, there's this, you know, publication, there's readership benefit, there's only a few, you know, when you come right down to it. So there's going to be ways they fit together, but it seems to me like that's all part of the same you're either going to pay per piece, you're going to pay in bulk in some way, and the way you pay in bulk is going to have a different framework that you could apply to it. So I think that if you looked at it as every single institution, you know, publisher, you know, how they're approaching the market, you might say, wow, this is usually fragmented. But my gut is that they're going to fall into some pretty clear buckets. So in that case, I would say maybe there's less fragmentation. It depends on how you look at the question. And so I do want us to. Did you want to put something in there, Raym? 30 seconds.
Because I think is really germane here. And one of the things that I think you're right. I mean, is that in that kind of framework I was talking about, a unifying framework, and that's what we see if we want to do collective funding for open infrastructure, for example. You're not trying to go out and sell or, you know, offer each one. You want to have a collective way, which raises issues on collective decision making, how they're maintained, portfolio management, you know, performance indicators, all these things, and that's something that SPARC's working on in cooperation with IOI and other projects to develop.
So anyway, I just want to take a second to thank both Sara and Raym for joining us. This was a fun and interesting topic, which I'm sure we'll be exploring in more depth in the future. I just want to thank everybody else for participating, and we will be back. We'll be doing another webinar in October when we release the new market sizing information from the Open Access Data and Analytics tool. So, you know, stay tuned for that. If you don't subscribe to our news and views, you can go to the website and subscribe, and then you will get that as soon as it comes out. But past news and views are also on the website. So thank you both very much, and thank everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.